which is us here today. Rather than writing all these URLs down, all you have to do is go to the one at the bottom of the screen, and they are all there and more. Some upcoming events. Well, June's PTC User World event isn't upcoming anymore. It was just 2 weeks ago. People are still starting to post their impressions, and they're around the web. Next month, we've got Rick Ernst from New Book Production. He's going to show the full process, data and authoring through to including illustrations from IsoDraw. And in August, we've got, this one is more of a business and ROI sort of presentation from Todd Nolan at a large Canadian telecom. They are 10 years into their implementation, and he hasn't touched his style sheets in 6 years. He supports 200 authors with 1 tools person. In September, we're going to talk about doing math and XML, and that we're having Design Science show off sort of how to do it. They're sort of the canonical way of doing it. And if you're looking for a place to meet up with people looking at content and XML publishing and all kinds of things, and you have conference budget, the end of September, beginning of October is LavaCon in San Diego. All right. And so now we'll go to you, Trevor, and we'll begin the presentation. Here we go.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Thank you, Liz and Janice. As mentioned, Trevor Hendricks with Kohler Company. I'm actually a senior technical writer, although I have to admit I don't write anything other than code. But today we're just going to talk a little bit about IsoDraw customization, some of the things we've learned through time. What we'll basically be covering is advantages of setting preference files for use in importing, exporting, and sharing your IsoDraw files. Basics of toolbars and why you should be using them. Some of the suggested macro applications that we've come up with that have helped us. And then also some disadvantages to all three. Shortcomings, perhaps, things we've had to deal with. And just a little bit, in case you weren't aware, where to find some of those files. Start with the preference file. Basically, you have the tools and preferences. Anything you can see in there, you can set. Some of the advantages, though, are consistency of the options. We have creativity is great, but in a technical setting, we want to limit that. We want our dash lines to be similar across all of our publications. We want all the same line weights. So, for instance, we set up a lot of pens that our guys can choose from, use that they want. It also, setting these preference files also allows for a default starting point for importation. Basically bringing in a file from Illustrator in our case. We had a lot of problems with people playing with the settings and couldn't get it figured out. So we figured out the best, set it up, and they don't have to worry about it anymore. We also work with ProE, which we've set a basic starting point for the import settings. Guys can tweak them as they feel fit in that regards to control detail. But we've got a nice starting point. And then export settings has been a lifesaver for us. We kind of had to customize IsoDraw to work with existing tools, as most anyone would. In our case, we had to make sure that EPS files worked with some custom tools that we had going to produce our PDFs. Default settings did not work, so once we figured them out, we were able to add those to the preference files, and every file then had that set in, and we didn't have to worry about anyone having to tweak or putting it into macros to control the exact export settings. Some of the disadvantages we've found is that the preference files are actually embedded into the IsoDraw files, which kind of goes against what I just said, but the problem there is that we didn't find the custom settings that we needed until a couple months down the road. So we already had hundreds of files created with the old preference. We have found actually a workaround. It's not a pretty thing, but it works. The only disadvantage with the workaround is basically a macro. The problem with that is that it actually resets the auto IDs that come in with object settings. That can actually be found on the PTC users forum. We use it regularly for various items. And then just a piece of advice more than maybe a disadvantage is just to make sure that when you're going through the preference files, if you choose to do that, that you go through and you set any font options that you can see. We set the ones we knew we'd use. We weren't going to use callouts. It didn't meet the needs we had at the time. So we didn't set those settings. What we found out, though, is even though you're not using the font associated with callouts, it's still embedded in that file. So if you haven't seen it, you might get files back from a vendor or from, in our case, we have China Associates, and it can't find the fonts because it tried embedding something that they had instead of what we had set it at. And we'll move on in a moment, but I want to ask if there are any questions at this point.
I have no questions yet. Again, if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the box.
We'll go to toolbars. Now, toolbars, we found a lot of use for them. Basically, it's providing a lot friendlier interface for our users. Without toolbars, you basically have to go to the top toolbar and select macros, and you can see a subset depending on how many macros you have. It's just not very friendly, especially when you're going to be running a macro maybe 60 or more times on one page. We also found that organizing them, for instance, we have a general toolbar. It's got our basic save, print PDF with a proof mark, import from Illustrator, saves us some steps from getting them in. And then we also have some for, well, we add a lot of metadata to our files for interactive web pages, and we have a couple macros that are associated with that, and those are on their own macro. So depending on what the user is going to be doing, they can have that specific toolbar up, and then they don't have to worry about mixing them up with others. Not a lot of disadvantages here, but the ones that we have run into is that you're limited to an icon. You can see at the bottom here in the example, and that's actually blown up. So the icons are they're small. There's not a default setting for those, or a default location for those. The ones that are actually available in the toolbar creation are actually hard-coded into the program. So you have to figure out a unified location for those. And there's actually a toolbar preference file, same with the other preference file, that you have to actually have the C:\temp and then your icon name in. The macros have saved us the most trouble in time through the entire time. It's let us simplify a lot of repetitive and complex tasks. Mentioned earlier, we do some interactive web pages using IsoDraw. Just to give you an idea, we actually take when you roll over a part, I should explain, we actually have service parse pages. So for instance, we do faucets. And if you need to order a valve, we actually have liner of the valve in the complete faucet. When you roll over the valve, it highlights. If anything else you might get along with that, maybe a nut to hold it down, highlight as well. We use the auto IDs that are created by IsoDraw to identify those, but they have to be added to a text string. We do that all through macros. It saves us hours per page being able to do that. We've also, it's allowed us to do a lot of control. As I mentioned earlier, creativity is great, but when it comes to technical art and things that tools are dependent upon, we need to have some control. So we have actually replaced, or I guess added on to the save function. You can still do your save, but for all of our art, there's an actual save button that you hit, and it saves your IsoDraw file to wherever you were working. So some of our illustrators like working on their desktop. So it'll save it there. It'll save it back to a master location so that everyone has access to that file. And in our case, it'll actually export all of the EPS files that we require for our publications. There are some disadvantages. This is just because I've spent a lot of time on it. There's some missing functionality, or what I might consider missing functionality. Really not a way to handle errors. If an error occurs, you get a message that shows you the line it died on, but it doesn't say why it died.
Oh, shoot. I think we lost Trevor.
Okay. Let's see.
He's doing something.
Okay, meet me here.
Trevor, we lost you.
Okay. I hear some in the background. Was that you or was that Trevor?
I think that's me.
Okay. Well, I've typed in a message. Okay.
I will try to reach him. Can you pause the recording?
Then I realized my screen's gone, and then looking in the little green light thing I have, you guys on speakerphone is gone. So.
I figured if I took away the presentation window, you'd get my message that we couldn't hear you.
As soon as I saw that, I saw the little box to the right. That's what I get for coming in on the weekend. Anyway.
All right, can you start the recording again? All right, and returning back to you.
Okay.
I have two questions written down that you were kind of going through. You said, and it's back a little bit. You said that you had a rollover. Are you ordering parts directly from the rollover image?
Yes. Let me pull it up real quick.
That would be very cool to see.
This is our online store. I'm probably not going to go to give the best example here, but you can come in and pull up your product. And again, this is an old fuss, been around for a long time, so there's a lot of history on it. So this is what we actually have. It's basically line art that you can roll over.
Ooh.
And actually select, and then situations like this, we can have both the O-ring and the component itself, highlight.
Cool.
And then when you can click on it, I'll apologize. Some of our marketing guys wanted color images, so it's not the best there, but
wow.
On the website.
Very cool. And so you made macros to make the selection and interaction easy?
Right. When you, I'll go back to this example. We needed something that identified the art. So basically in IsoDraw, this object would actually be one group. This leader line and the part number would be another group.
Okay.
And depending on who is doing it, this part, this bracket, and this part number would be another group. And those groups all have their unique identifications. So what we do is when we run the macro, we give it a name of this 77955. And then there's actually, in the DTD for that particular, for this file type, there's what's called a hotspot list. It's just a attribute. And what we'll do is we'll put the ID from this one as well as this one into that field. So when you roll over this, it knows this needs to highlight and this. Then we repeat it for this and back. And then for like this one here, we'd run it on this group, give it this 75878 number, but we also want that O-ring to highlight, so we would also add that.
Okay.
It's all done by basically clicking around on the page.
Cool. Oh, all right. So let's see, I think, yeah, because you were saying that the macro saved hours per day, and I can start to see that now, especially since you've got multiple groups.
That was one of our first ones, so
Cool.
I can't go on without that being ranked. It'll drive me nuts the rest of the day.
All right.
So we are on disadvantages then. Oh, did you say there was another question?
We were right here, and I was going to ask about how the macro saved hours per day, whether you could explain sort of how that worked, and I think you just did.
Okay.
With multiple groups, I could see that you'd really need to have a way to group those things.
Works pretty slick. Took a little time, but we actually had it doing this through a previous software, Corel Author, which I'd be surprised if anybody even remembers. But it was all done by custom programming from an outside source. The nice thing about this is it was all done in-house. So if something breaks, we have to fix it, yes, but we know how to fix it, which is nice.
Cool. Very true. All right. I'll let you continue.
We'll go with disadvantages. Basically, some of the shortcuts of or short things on the macros is that there's really not an error handling inherent in the macro language. It's basically if a particular line of code breaks, you see that line of code in a message box. There's no explanation of what happens. There's no way to actually handle that error. So, if the macro is expecting a text string and there's nothing there, you either have to program for that, but there's not. If that error occurs, it will just spit up that error box, which the only issue we've really seen with that, and we're luckily a little bit smaller user group, maybe 10 users roughly, but there's been confusion and they don't know what it means when they see an error. There's no way to give them a message that says this is what happened or this is something that you need to take care of. It's something the macro can't do. By default for input boxes, you can prompt the user for input. Say you want to control the creation of an arc, but you want radius. And we want the radius to always be just start at a ½ inch. That's the most common. We want to default that, but allow them to change it. There's no way to actually put a default value in the input box. Again, you get used to it. It's not a humongous deal, but it'd be nice if it was there. Importing information from external sources, and what I mean by that is, say you have a text file or an XML file, anything external to IsoDraw, and you want to grab the text and pull it into IsoDraw and fill a text element with it. There's really not a built-in way to do that. And the closest we found, and working through the workaround right now on the PTC users forum, there's what's called a text excerpt, which is mainly used for translation. It basically takes all of the text on the page, exports it into a text file in a 2-column. First column is the ID that I've talked about in the past, and the second column is what actually the text is. And it's basically for translation. You can translate that, and then you open that text file back up with IsoDraw, and it updates the matching IDs. It is handy. So what our workaround is, we found that we could delete stuff out of that text file, and it would just import the ones that it found and leave the others untouched. So the workaround basically creates a text element on the screen and takes the auto ID and manually creates a text file external, matching the format of what normally comes out. You can do whatever you want with that file then. In our case, it was somebody that was trying to, sorry, not in our case, but the case we're addressing, is someone wanting to control the naming of the files by pulling from a database the name. So she can run her Perl script, recreate that text file with that appropriate string, and then open it just like a regular text insert. It updates that string or that text element. The text element's value then gets assigned to a variable, deletes the text element, and then you can do whatever you want with that variable value. I invite you to take a look at the user forum because I know there was a lot there to go through. Some of the other items is that it would be nice if we could actually suspend a refresh of the screen until the macro is complete. We do, as I mentioned with our save, we do the export of the EPS files, we save the ISO file in 2 locations. But what I didn't mention is that in the start of that, before it even allows you to do it, it runs a bunch of, call them standard checks. Our art is generally an art layer and then language layers. Well, our macros go through and make sure that our art layer contains only art, no text allowed. Our text layers only allow text, no art. We give messages if it doesn't and says you have to meet these standards before it'll save. And it also checks for the art to be in the right bounding box, that the fonts are correct. The biggest one we found is that font being correct. The suspend refresh would really benefit there because when you do that, you're actually selecting the text. If you've got a lot of text on the page, it will take a while to run, quite a while to run actually, because it has to select every one, and then if you select more than once, you're selecting it more than once and waiting for that time. It's something that VB generally lets you do. We would like to get that, but I've heard that may be added a little bit later. This next one, PTC has said they would be addressing at some point in the future, but there's no shortcut keys for running your macros. Our workaround currently really is just using those toolbars, and it has paid off. But we'd really like it if we could say, hit Control-D to run a macro. As I mentioned, we sometimes run a macro more than 60 times on a single page, specifically hotspotting, or the metadata adding macro that I mentioned. Getting away from toolbars would be quite nice, and being able to do some control with shortcut keys would be a benefit. Before I move on, any more questions yet?
How many macros do you have now?
I should have done a count. Including sub-macros, probably around 40.
Wow. This is a small example here.
Sorry?
The picture shows a small example, I guess?
Yes. I mentioned it earlier, is actually when you're going through this menu, you can only see the first group.
Oh.
So if you click on more macros, then you can see the rest of them. Here. Ignore the JPEGs, obviously, but those are our macros. There are some of these files actually contain more than one. I've got 39 individual text files. Apparently we've got over 40 macros. I haven't kept up on the count.
Wow.
But we do just about anything with them. Our translations are almost completely automated using it.
How many languages are you going to?
Currently we're doing English, of course, and French, Canadian, and Spanish. A couple others possibly in the future, and some of our other divisions are looking to move over, and they're using up to, I think it was 26 or 27 languages. So once they get going on board with IsoDraw, we'll see if they want to use some of what we have.
Cool. All right.
Some of the suggested macros, I mentioned the save has really helped us a lot. We had things such as items on the wrong layer, which you wouldn't think would cause too much problems, but as I mentioned, we do 3 languages. We do English, French, Spanish. So in those particular files, we actually have an art layer, an English layer, a French layer, a Spanish layer. When you run your save, it makes the art and English layer and export an appropriately named file. Then it hides the English, makes the French visible, exports that, and then it does Spanish as well.
Wow.
So, making sure that things are on the right layer is important. We've also added a bounding box, which just seemed like one of those things that people forgot to do, and our outputs always were off because of that. It was usually caught, it was caught, but something our writers were seeing versus our illustrators. We've automated that aspect as well.
What kind of issues did you see when that was the case?
Well, if a bounding box was actually off, when we published, the art could be shifted, where you might only even see half of the art in the final PDF, or not at all.
Wow. Okay.
We also see that when things are outside of outside of that bounding box, so we would check there as well. The other things, we do a couple publications. The one that I showed with the interactive online is completely IsoDraw. And we do some labeling that's also through IsoDraw. And because of that, our management wanted to have proof marks on the publication. So we created a macro that actually puts a proof mark on those publications so that they can be seen by people external to our department. Another one that's saved quite a bit of time is our translations. Our art, when an illustrator is actually working in an art file, they create an art layer and an English layer. That's all they do. When it goes to our translation group, they run a macro for whatever languages they want. There's a separate macro for each one. But it creates a temporary French, temporary Spanish, and it does a text excerpt file that they can run through our translation tool. Then when they're ready to bring it back in, they hit another macro that brings all of the languages in, updates all of the layers, and at most they have to go through each layer and just make sure the text isn't overlapping any part.
Sure. Sure. Do you see that happen fairly regularly, or I guess not with French and Spanish?
Spanish. English of the 3 is probably the shorter language for the type of translations we have. Spanish tends to be at least 30% longer. Well, and I'll mention one of the disadvantages that it's not a disadvantage, it's just how the world works, I guess, is if you have a text element in English that says the spoon jumped through a hoop, and it's actually on 2 lines, when you bring it back in from a translation, even if the translation is the same length, it doesn't do the wrap. So you have to manually go in and re-wrap the text to fit the existing location. But it's a minor thing. It's generally just somebody going in and clicking on the text box and putting in a return.
Okay. And that includes the pop-up, like we saw on the website, as well as what's in the image.
Well, actually, those pop-ups aren't in the files. Pull that back up. Still got that. If I roll over this, you see the 77955.
Yep.
And the O-ring. The only aspect actually in the file is the 77955. There's a piece of metadata that has that value assigned, and that's it. The O-ring is actually a cross-reference over to a table that contains all of our descriptions. We use SAP for all of our ordering. There's a nightly dump, so we get updated descriptions daily. So there's a little, this viewer is actually a little, it's customized for us, obviously, but it has some string to grab that text field and add it on.
Okay. Got it.
A couple other ones. As mentioned, the bounding box has saved us a lot of trouble. It's a simple thing, but it's one less item that our illustrators have to worry about, but that has to be done to every file. I also mentioned that we do a lot of our standards checks, make sure that the elements aren't outside of that bounding box, make sure that the contents of the layers, art is art, text is text. And depending on, so one of our main publishing tools depends on a particular font being used. And every once in a while we get somebody who's creative, so it makes sure that they're only using those fonts. It is a lot of headache. And then the other one I mentioned, this is out on the PTC user forum, is updating preferences. So you can understand the basic idea there. It mainly creates a temporary file in your C temp directory, and it reads the layer name, and it closes the file that you're actually trying to update, and then imports that layer into the text file, or I'm sorry, into the temporary file. And then it opens up the one you're trying to update, grabs the next layer, and just keeps repeating that process. And then when it's done, the temporary file gets named or overwrites the one that you were trying to update. Works pretty nice. It's a little slow, but it gets the job done. But I throw this in. IsoDraw has some really good documentation on their macros, but this is one that we found that isn't actually documented. It's supposed to be at some point in the future, but it's the launch command. In 7.0 of IsoDraw, you couldn't make a PDF. You could export an EPS, which was great. You could use Distiller, but we were working with our illustrators who didn't want to learn how to do that. So our situation with this is we could export an EPS file, and then using the launch command, we could actually kick off Adobe Distiller to be able to installed in the same location, and it automatically converts that EPS to a PDF. There's a lot of things you can do with this. We use it quite a bit. And this is some of the basic documentation.
I think we lost him again. Janice?
Typing a message.
It's been a great benefit. We've had a lot of issues if we didn't have this available. Hopefully I'll make
like what kinds of things? Sorry to interrupt, but like what other kinds of things have you launched?
Well, we do the PDFs, as I mentioned. The service parts pages that I showed online that are interactive. Mm-hmm. All of the metadata and the art is done in IsoDraw, but we actually do an external conversion to that makes it into a Flash file. So the process to kick that off is actually done through a launch command. The file gets exported to a waiting folder. Launch command kicks off a batch to run the converter and bring it back to the user's computer. We use it for our translation macros. The text excerpt that comes out of there won't actually run through our translation software as is. So we do a really simple change using Perl script to make it into an HTML file. But you have to run it on every file. So we just, when we kick out the file, the launch command kicks off and runs that batch file, that Perl script to convert the file.
Cool.
Trying to remember what else we use it for.
Cool.
We also do a lot of our logging. We like to all of our art files are in shared locations, so we don't have a way of saying who touched what last. So one of the, well, I guess kind of a shortcoming is there's no way to know in IsoDraw, basically an environmental variable, who are you? So when we write our log file, instead of using the built-in system, we actually kick off a batch file, and I shouldn't even say batch file, it's just an echo statement that says, who's the user, here's the file name, this is the date, and add to a text file.
Cool.
Hopefully I'll make it the rest of the way. So, in regards to file locations, start off by saying that I realize each of these file types can actually be in two different locations to start off with. These are the ones that we've found have worked the best for us. For our preference and toolbar files, it's basically by user. When you first start up IsoDraw, it actually creates a file structure in your document setting folder. It contains your preference file, your toolbar file, DTD, there's a couple of other items out there. But since of the two locations, this one is read first, so we replace this one to make sure they're using our preference file. In regards to macros, we basically just recommend the install path of IsoDraw. It's a simple spot. As long as IsoDraw is on the same spot in everybody's computer, it's in the same location. And the reason we use this as well is since we use toolbars, we needed a stationary location for all of our toolbar images. This gives us that.
Cool. Yeah, we used to have to do this with Arbortext back in the day, similar issue.
And we found a pretty smooth workaround for distributing our files now. So basically what we actually do is in the startup folder for all of our users. When we have a new user, they get a little BBS script that they put in their startup folder. And it just checks for the network location. Once it sees it, it kicks off a batch file. And I have to apologize if you saw my desktop or even my bar at the bottom, you can see I like batch files. We have that shared location, kicks off that batch file, and that batch file basically clears a couple directories to make sure there's nothing that's going to screw up anything, and then it copies over all the custom files.
Nice.
It's all, when it's done, the user just gets a little prompt on the screen that says your files have been updated. Happens daily. We know that it's nice for us, and specifically me, as support, because when I go over to somebody's computer, if they're having problems with the macro, one of the first things I'll generally do is rerun that script. That way I know they're working with what I provided. If they start doing customizations on their own, obviously they're kind of on their own, but good way to restart. Shut down the IsoDraw and do that. And it actually quite often solves problems because all of a sudden a toolbar disappears. You rerun that, it's back. So works pretty nice.
Handy.
I have to apologize. I don't have a lot of resources. Basically, I've depended on the documentation of IsoDraw, but the two external sources I found is the PTC forums have actually turned out to be really good. There's some good gentlemen out there, and ladies, sorry, that have provided a lot of input on macros in just different directions that I hadn't even thought of. And then actually the same with the PTC user group. Well, Liz is the head of that, so she got me involved with that some, which, yes, Liz, I've made a note that I will start giving you some more code to add to what you have.
That'd be great.
Actually, the end of my written presentation. Do you have any questions?
So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the box.
And I interrupted a whole bunch asking mine as we were going. All right.
They're in stunned silence. They're overwhelmed.
This is really great, Trevor. I didn't know how much customization you could do with IsoDraw, having been sort of the other side of the authoring side of the house rather than the illustrative side.
I am getting, sorry, I'm getting comments from the gallery, and actually they're paying attention, and they said that you know, I'm getting a lot of thanks for the presentation. This was a great presentation on macros. So, and somebody else is now confirming, yes, we are paying attention. So I think that I think you covered so much in there, and you covered it so well. That's probably why there's not a whole lot of questions, because you were very thorough in how you were covering it, even though we, you know, dropped the call a couple of times.
As I mentioned, my email address is on the front page, which I'll go back to. I'm more than willing to help people with issues if I find it a challenge. Of course, the more detail you give me, the more I can help, but otherwise the forums are good. Some of the macros that I mentioned, I'll try to get over to you, Liz. The updating.
I'm going to add you as a contributor. You'll be posting them there.
Okay, here's the question. The rollovers on the web page were done by code on the web server, correct?
The actual rollovers, when you kind of a mix. Well, here, let me do this. See if I have one sitting around. Sorry, big file or big folder takes a while. Okay, that's a decent one. You never know when you're just grabbing a random file. This is how our files actually look when they're done. This is actually the information that's contained. The only thing that's actually maintained in the file is actually this, and then this. Well, you can see the auto ID list, which, see, the first one matches this. The O-ring that I mentioned is actually done at the time of the rollover. It's not embedded in the file. We stuck away from that because on occasion our descriptions change, and the only way we'd be able to update them otherwise would be to run a file again. So there's actually a little script on the viewer that adds the O-ring text to the end of that, to the end of the 29614. Well, the appropriate part number, say. Should be an example of what you actually receive. Well, in this case, we actually do produce a PDF as well. I should have mentioned that. And we use that just for internal searches. This is how our file looks before they're actually in the viewer. So you still get a little pop-up, but you're just getting 33185 in this case. Later on, when you actually roll over within the viewer, that's when you receive the spout text that's added.
So here's another question. Do you use anything special to create the icons for the toolbars?
I guess I technically use, what is it even? Thumbs plus 7. Nothing special. I mean, you could technically use Paint without a problem. The only thing with those that I recommend is experiment a little bit with different file sizes. I think when I started looking, 32 by 32 works pretty well.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Trevor. Do we have any more questions, Janice? I think we lost him.
No more questions. Just a comment. Thank you for that, because it always takes me a while to create icons.
Yeah, I do have some. I think I have the standard kind of written on what we're using. Seems to work pretty well. I can pass that along to you.
Okay. So another question came in, but I'll field this one. So the recording for this session, we will send out an announcement once the recording is posted, and it'll be up on the PTC user site. So you'll get a link to that once it's live and on the site.
And don't forget to come back next week for more IsoDraw. Or next month, I'm sorry. Next month. Oh, my goodness. Trevor, I can't thank you enough for showing us this. I'm glad to know how much I can do, actually, beyond what's there. And I haven't had that experience with IsoDraw, and I'm glad to get it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yes, that was great.
Oh.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. There's no more questions in the queue, so I wish you all a great weekend. And another comment just came in and said that Trevor is great help in the PTC forum. Thanks a lot. So keep up the good work, Trevor.
You're welcome.
All righty. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.